Awesome.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a meeting today with Dr. Sarah Hancock. And thank you for coming today, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Katie. It's really nice to be invited onto your podcast, and it's lovely to catch up with you as well, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Sarah Hancock is a research analyst at the University of Adelaide in the School of Public Health. She is a thought leader in advancing the role of nutrition for the prevention of poor oral health. And this is where you want to listen up, people. If you have children, if you have any dental issues, Sarah Hancock is the master of this information. So she terms tooth decay as the earliest manifestation of the effects of a poor quality diet on metabolic health. She's an advocate for dietary lifestyles that minimize the intake of highly refined, ultra processed foods for the prevention of poor oral health and chronic diet related disease. She's presented at conferences, she's led workshops on health, nutrition, and behavioral change. And we are going to unpack the links today between oral health and general health. Welcome, Dr. Sarah Hancock. So lovely to have you here today.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Katie, and thank you for the very nice introduction. I was listening to that, so I think, oh, wow. Yeah, yeah, it's really cool, and it's really good to be here, and it's really nice to catch up with you, especially when you're doing such great work in the brain health space with nutrition, lifestyle, sleep, exercise, and all those pillars of health that
Yeah.
are really important to maintain for good overall health so that we can actually get on and do the things that you want to do, that we all want to do in this life
Yeah.
as a functioning member of society as well too. So it's really good to be here, and it's an honor and a privilege to be talking to you today.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I think the work that you're doing, the linking with oral health and general health and what you've done your PhD
Mm.
on is amazing. So I want to share it because I think that what you have discovered and what you've studied, people need to know about it, Sarah, so that they can make
Mm.
changes to prevent chronic long-term illness and especially for the health of their kids.
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah.
what got you into studying oral health in the first place?
Yeah, it's really interesting because wasn't so much getting into oral health or anything like that. Like I never had any desire to be a dentist or a dental therapist or anything like that. But I've always been interested in health in general, and particularly child health. And it probably stems from when my sister was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 8 years old and I was 10. And on the day she was diagnosed, we were living in Peel Forest at the time, which is a really remote community in the central South Island, sort of in that mid South Canterbury area. And I went and stayed with my grandmother who lived 4 doors up the road. And all I knew at that point was that she had diabetes. There was no cure for it, and that she was going to be injecting herself with insulin for the rest of her life because the pump hadn't been invented. This was 1984, and it was 4 days before Christmas. So, a busy time anyway. And for that to then to come moving into our family's life was, really quite a turning event. And so my grandmother, well, she had all these encyclopedias that were first published in 1941. I mean, she was the sort of person who, well, that's the sort of thing she bought when her first child was born, which is interesting in and of itself. And so we went out into the garage where those were stored because by then she was just living in a 2-bedroom little cottage in Peel Forest. And we dug out then, D for diabetes and looked it up. And because this was 1941, there's some really most interesting information was that insulin was a lifesaver, and it was still regarded back then as one of the more important inventions in that field. But also that there was another form of diabetes, and it was really quite rare, but it presented in people who didn't tolerate refined carbohydrates very well. So they were advised to reduce their intake of porridge, flour-based foods, sugars, and they were to eat diets that had a high proportion of foods like bacon and eggs. And I can remember looking at that, and I can still remember even just the whole garage itself. I can still remember the wooden walls and the sunlight streaming in through a window and being able to see the dust, and thinking that it was just brutally unfair that my 8-year-old sister was going to have to inject herself with diabetes, because the far more easier option would be that version of the disease, which would have you eating bacon and eggs for breakfast. What's not
Wow.
to like
And that
about
was at 10. That was at 10 years
I
old.
was
Like
10.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was a bit of a reader.
Yeah.
Young,
Obviously.
a nascent geek even at that point. But I was just really quite scared, because in that way that your parents, I could tell by the looks on their faces with this, that this was just serious. And so a few days later, on Christmas Day, we're in the hospital and we're allowed to take Diana out for the morning, because she was still under hospital care at that point. And so we went out and we went to have Christmas dinner at my aunt and uncle's farm out of Parrioral West, just west of Timaru. We came back and they try and get all the kids out of the children's ward on Christmas Day to have dinner with their families. But when we came back in, the whole place was chock full of people who had had accidents on roller skates and skateboards, because this was 1984. And there
Yeah.
was one kid, and we were all just sitting in the waiting room while my mum was off sort of talking to nurses, doctors, and whatnot. And there was this one child who had been like, the whole side of his face was just a graze, and he had armless sling, and his leg was grazed, and he just looked like he'd been pulled along behind the back of a truck on a shingle road. Whereas my sister was sitting there completely unmarked, still sort of wearing nice clothes that she got for Christmas. And curiosity got the better of this. The dad who was sitting there with him, who said, "So, why are you here?" And my dad said, "Oh, she's been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes." And this dad said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's awful." And he told his kid to, be a bit grateful that he was going to walk out of here in 3 days,
Oh,
two,
wow.
two, 3 days time. And that actually for all the, for the relatively clean, relatively more healthier looking child by then, that this was still going to be, something she'd have to deal with for the rest of her life. And he said, "Look, your broken collarbone, if that's what you've got, is going to be fixed. You've got 6 weeks of sitting around in summer." But yeah, so that was quite serious. And so, of course, there's this very early awareness of the impact of food on health,
Mm.
the impact on exercise on our health, because everything was so carefully titrated with type 1 diabetes that if any of that sort of stuff is misaligned or out of whack, she'd get very, very sick very, very quickly. And that happened relatively few times, but it was still, there's an awareness there. There's a whole lot of mental work. Like as a teenager, when she was having to sit exams, you've got to keep your nervous system under control, not get too nervous, because that's going to have an effect on your blood sugars. She did really well at school. She was, very strong academically, which was a great thing, because there is a lot of school missed because of illness, that sort of thing. But
Do
she's
you,
done really well.
Sarah,
But that was a thing.
do you
Yeah.
think that people understand the severity of type 1 and type 2 diabetes now?
I think with type 1, it's definitely the minority of all diagnosed cases of diabetes. They should almost be two different things, because one's an autoimmune disease.
Yes.
And I think until people actually know somebody with it, like whether it's a child's classmate, they've got absolutely no idea how you can be fine, 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 and then be very, very ill very quickly with type 1 diabetes. With type 2 diabetes, it's kind of been like this sort of silent but growing epidemic, and it's ironic because it was originally a rich person's disease.
Mm.
It sort of started with the tea drinking classes in Britain, and they were the people who were having the high sugar foods. But now it is overwhelmingly, well, it's sort of, right through the population, but where the burden is being borne heaviest is in lower socioeconomic groups and in a number of indigenous populations worldwide and in developing countries. I think India, for instance, has the highest growing rate of type 2 diabetes
Wow.
diagnoses, because they've all been told to get rid of the ghee or the animal fats that they were using, and to use vegetable oils in cooking. And yeah, and it's
Wow.
absolutely devastating over there. So, and I think also, you know, type 2 diabetes was so rare, and was still relatively rare in the early 1980s. Like, I didn't know any adult who had it.
Mm.
And then, life moved on. I went and got a physical education degree and lived in Britain for about 4 years, came back, and so many people of
Were
my
you a
parents'
PE teacher?
generation. No, I wanted
Oh,
to be a physical, a exercise physiology researcher, and
oh,
did
okay.
an honors degree in that.
You didn't want
And
to chuck
then we
around the rugby
moved.
ball.
Yeah. Yeah, so I went into that to do the exercise physiology psychology, because we're all told that in the 80s that if you keep exercising, you'll have a long and happy and healthy life.
Yeah,
And
I still
then there was a
remember my
diet
mother
trend.
bopping round to Richard Simmons.
Yeah, yeah, that was all the rage back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then noticed that there were just more and more people getting diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and it was so normalized.
Mm,
It was just, people get diagnosed, and that was just part of getting older. And I can remember sort of thinking, but surely you've had a crack at trying to control this with diet. And so, there are lots of more cases of type 2 diabetes, but also lots more people requiring insulin medication for it, which
mm,
was a bit puzzling for something that I first learned at 10 years old could be controlled with diet.
wow.
Yeah, got
What,
sort of more interested in it. And then when our younger daughter, Evelyn, was about 4 years old, this was back in the early 2000s, she was diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
mm,
And so back we were monitoring food, diet, what made her feel good, what didn't make her feel good. And then a lot of the gluten-free foods on the market were awful. And I spent a lot of time just trying to make things nice, but
mm,
they required an awful lot of sugar. And I just sort of thought, this is actually really not fun. And of course, then she moves into school, and that gets increasingly difficult to navigate as well too. And then came across the other diet movements, for want of a better word, like Atkins, paleo, low carb, healthy fat, ketogenic, that were just becoming more and more sort of prominent, and sort of started looking into those, and sort of happened upon the which all, much of these things had in common was just getting rid of those whole grain products. I sort of thought, well, this is good, because then we can come up with a different way of eating that's not reliant on carb-based foods. And, there are other things going on. I was doing training for half Ironmans and, those endurance events around Taupo, and finding that actually increasing the protein load and maintaining that was an important key to actually remaining well, not getting overtrained, not getting injured, or if there are any niggles, just recovering from that really quickly. And then just sort of thought, well, actually had the opportunity after we got a case resolved, with regard to a damaged house from the Christchurch earthquakes, to do some postgraduate study. And then sort of looked, okay, well, what do we have to say about this, and where are the gaps? And sort of looking at, okay, what puts children in hospital? Because I've always got this interest in child health. And the biggest cause of hospitalisation in children under 14 is to have one or more teeth removed under general anaesthetic, and several thousand preschool children per year.
hold on, hold
So
on, hold on. Just say that slowly so everyone can hear you, please.
yeah,
'Cause that's a
okay.
phenomenal statistic. And for those of you watching outside of New Zealand, these statistics will also relate to you.
Okay, so 29,000 children in New Zealand per year under the age of 14 will have a tooth removed, one or more teeth removed, for dental decay. Several thousand of those children are preschoolers who are or under fives, and 29 to 30 preschoolers will go under a general anaesthetic to have one or more teeth removed before their 5th birthday. So in the time that it's going to take to record this podcast, 2 New Zealand children will have lost multiple teeth.
Yeah, yeah. And that's because of damage. That's
It's
because of damage.
because of tooth decay. It's the earliest manifestation in the life course of a chronic diet-related disease. We talk about pre-diabetes and diabetes, although that's occurring in increasingly young populations, particularly in Māori and Pacific Island populations. We know that poor diet is linked to poor mental health, and we've got a mental health epidemic at the moment. which, didn't really exist. The proportion of children suffering poor mental health is rising increasingly, and there's been some very good work done by Professor Julia Rutledge in Christchurch around this. But the dental health element of it, which is painful, and that's occurring at increasingly young ages, and so we've got all these children losing their teeth. That does damage the jaw and the gums, and it has an impact on the other teeth that are coming through. But there's been, complete apathy almost at senior levels with regard to addressing this in any meaningful way regarding prevention. Yeah, well, the main focus of prevention has been just brush your teeth and floss and go and see your dentist. But there's been actually little public linking there has been some campaigning by people like Dr. Rob Beaglehole and Dr. Simon Thornley and other anti-sugar campaigners on the effect of poor diet on oral health. But there's little being done about it at high levels, which is disappointing.
Yeah, because I was finding it quite interesting. Sarah, there was a big article on one of the New Zealand talk shows about salt and how they're doing a big campaign on reducing salt, and I said to Simon, why aren't they addressing the elephant in the room, which is sugar?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of mental health, the symptoms that it causes when blood sugars are unstable. Mirrors anxiety, depression, irritability, even bipolar, up and down, up and down. This is what's happening.
Yeah.
So
and it's carry on.
Sorry, you go, Sarah. You go.
And it's not just the usual culprit, high sugar foods. We know that it's the ultra processed stuff that's not necessarily sweet, but when these things are consumed as between meal snacks, one of the papers from a PhD actually found that actually that's associated with greater caries burdens, or than not snacking on these foods between meals. Except our dietary guidelines in New Zealand actually recommend that children have up to 6 eating episodes per day.
Yeah.
And including these refined carbohydrate-based foods, and they go on to
in the hospital, Sarah. I took Layla when she broke her collarbone. We went to the hospital, and I'll probably get fined from somebody for putting this on Facebook. But in the leaflets, it was still saying eating between, I think it was like 8 to 11 serves of carbohydrate a day, and that included bread, but it didn't say what type of bread.
Yeah, and it included, even have things like muffins, toasted muffins, crumpets, which I don't think anyone just eats a crumpet by itself, but it's just a really sweet thing.
Yeah.
And people pile jam and sugar or jam or honey on that. And it just seems astounding that those are recommended snacks because, they're an important source of energy for growing children. And so when a lot of the health promotion advice that is publicly available at all parts of the life course, whether it's how to feed your toddlers, how to feed your preschoolers, how to feed your school-age children, what we serve people in hospitals, what we serve people in rest homes, it's all underpinned by guidelines that actually undermine any sort of healthy eating messaging. And aren't based on the totality of evidence.
It's scary, isn't it? Because what we were talking about before the interview started is that I don't think that people understand how those carbohydrates break into sugar, because when you go to the supermarket, you see, like organic date bars with pictures of skipping unicorns, and you think, oh, I'll put that in my child's lunchbox.
Especially if on the same packet it says whole grain, or it's been fortified with vitamins.
With fairy poo.
I think possibly a better approach to all of this might be because, people have been battling with the whole fat versus carbs versus sugar versus protein, that sort of thing. So I think, well, possibly if we look at food quality, and if we regard a high quality diet as something that you are, where you're preparing foods to eat with your family from whole and unprocessed sources, whether it's your seeds, your nuts, your dairy products, your meat, your eggs, your vegetables, your fruit, you're probably going to hit a lot of your vitamin and nutrient daily recommended intakes, particularly if you maintain a decent protein intake. And there's plenty of evidence that we, particularly women, and that kids are not getting enough protein during the day, to actually, function well. So that's an issue. But I think, when we get into quality, because there's no evidence that say boiled potatoes are going to cause tooth decay, because what we don't eat foods in isolation. We eat meals.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't
yeah.
go shopping at the supermarket for, I don't take a list that says fat, carbs, and protein and some sugars and vitamins and minerals. I'll have, like, say, berries, yogurt, chicken, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think if we can move the conversation to sort of acknowledging and recognizing the harms of ultra processed foods on the gut biome, the mental health, dental health, all those conditions associated with type 2 diabetes, that might be a more constructive step forward than, looking at algorithms and just, looking at those ultra processed foods, which are, they're hyper palatable because they've been engineered to be as such. They are designed to encourage consumption when you're doing sedentary things like eating a bunch of Pringles while watching TV or the movies.
And
They
the
are
whole thing that
cheap
the
to
guy
make.
he won a Nobel Prize for finding the bliss point.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not going to say what I'm thinking right now. What should happen, man?
Yeah, but it's like, and they're packaged attractively, and you
Mm,
don't need to do any more additional preparation to consume them. You can
yeah.
get that rice cake thing, splat whatever on it, and just eat it.
Mm,
And they're marketed quite aggressively, and that they're associated with disruptions to sleep and reductions in your motivation to exercise. And so all these things are multi-directional as
mm,
far as how these foods have an impact on your general health on a daily basis.
and the fact
And
that they're
people might,
addictive as
and
well,
they're addictive. They're
you know,
hugely addictive.
hugely addictive. And that's where what I've seen, particularly in the mental health space, is that
Mm.
people, I mean, I used to binge on carbohydrates and I was never full. And
No, no.
you see that a lot with mental health as we go towards carbohydrate because it increases tryptophan, you know,
Yes.
in the brain.
Yeah.
But if we know that those foods, those processed foods are lighting up our brain like a gaming.
Yeah. Absolutely, because it has an effect on leptin regulation as well too, which is your
Yes.
satiety hormone. And so, you might have a lot of leptin floating around, but those receptors in the brain are not functioning properly. So you've got the leptin dysregulation. So people aren't feeling full, and it's promoting an eating cycle where people just keep going back and eating these foods
Mm,
that are recommended as snacks, but they're also very easy to eat fast.
mm, mm. Yeah,
Yeah, because
so
when people
fast.
go binge eating, they're not typically just going and chomping on the leftover lamb chops from the previous night's dinner, if indeed they've eaten that at all.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
they're grabbing those shelf stable products, and there's sort of an increasing amount of work being done now in that food addiction space.
Mm, mm,
That actually the intake of these things are associated with certain brain activation responses that you've described,
mm,
and therefore people just keep eating more of that. But so what happens there is you're actually displacing better quality food,
mm.
the stuff with a little to minimum human interference factor out of the diet. And so a diet is pretty much reflective of actually what the supermarket looks like, which is about 70% processed foods. And if a reasonable definition for all your listeners out there is, if you're sort of thinking, well, is this ultra processed or not? Well, hey, if it's got more than 5 ingredients on the back packet, and you can't pronounce a lot of those ingredients, and those ingredients don't look like anything that was running around, swimming around, flying around, or growing under or over the ground a few days ago, they're not really foods, and should we be putting them into our
Mm.
stomachs, or into our mouths first and foremost? Yeah, which is where, the problems with a poor quality diet are going to show up first and foremost.
Mm.
Yeah,
So for because I'm aware of our time, Sarah,
yeah.
why do you think it's important for people, and this is obviously from your research as well, why do you think it's important for people to be aware of the impact of sugar?
I think overall, the cost of poor health to individuals, their families, and the communities that they live in and the societies in which they operate in are huge.
Mm.
It's associated with a whole lot of distress and lack of quality of life, and a lack of functioning optimally, and just poor well-being,
Mm.
or relatively little well-being, in the same way that smoking and alcohol can cause, all this damage. But because we all eat food and we all need food, and there's so much angst and discord around healthy eating messaging, because we're getting, conflicting messages all the time, around what's healthy, what's not, particularly around meat or dairy or eggs or that sort of thing, which, us, society has been living on diets that have comprised all those things,
Yeah.
all around the world, without the degenerative disease that we're seeing today, and, the impact of type 2 diabetes and related disorders of heart disease and neurological disorders and eye damage and cancers, are more, are unprecedented now, at this particular point in history. And so there's a lot of misery being caused, huge public costs. Um, it's quite devastating,
Mm.
and also, it's, leading to a lot of community distress. I can say that I've been shocked by the number of people who have not reached their 50th birthdays, like I did a couple.
Wow.
Yeah, like 5 parents of children that my children went to kindergarten with are no longer here.
Wow.
When I was growing up, I didn't know many people who had cancer or who passed away under 50.
Mm.
It's happening increasingly often. A friend of mine, Dr. Chris Jackson, who until a couple of years ago, I think, was the medical director of the Cancer Society in New Zealand. He's a great oncologist.
Mm.
He said, yeah, definitely seeing more bowel cancer in New Zealanders, and in the people born after 1990 is the
Oh
group
my
that they're
God.
starting to see this sort of thing. So these people are only in their early to mid 30s when they're developing this, which I think is just heartbreakingly sad. In any case, yeah, I just took some notes here that
Mm.
there's increases in bowel cancer in under 50s, which is a cancer of your digestive system, isn't it?
Mm.
And, that's associated with dysregulation of the gut biome. So while there's all this health, there's a whole lot of early mortality. And you sort of think, well, what's the biggest tragedy that can befall a child is probably the loss of a parent before they've reached the age of majority.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I've been to some of these funerals, and these people's parents in their 70s are having to attend their funerals. So there's kids losing their parents, but there's elderly people who are losing their children long past the stage that they ever thought they'd have to worry about their kids ever again.
Mm. And it's
Yeah.
scary. It's scary, Sarah. I find it like with the conflicting information that's out there.
Mm.
And that's what I find interesting about the clinical research. Like they'll say, "Oh, well, meat causes bowel
Yeah.
cancer," but they're not saying where that meat has come from. And
Yeah.
then you start looking at the other dietary factors around it, particularly the sugar and the refined foods.
Yeah.
And it's just not fair. Like people are getting hurt.
Yeah,
That
absolutely. And on the meat eating, that's one of the, one of the things that we thought we might just get into discussing was, some of the patterns that we've noticed. And one of those, alongside the rise of non-communicable disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease being a thing, which it wasn't really prior to
I had it,
1980.
Sarah.
But you
I
probably
had
got
drinking.
rid of it. Yeah, but I
Yeah,
mean,
I've got
isn't
rid
that
of
a
it.
sign of the times? Because we probably grew up at around about the same time with health messaging that involved, a higher intake of carbohydrates, given that we're both quite sporty.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that was supposed to fuel us.
Yeah, but
But
wine isn't carbs, Sarah.
yeah,
No,
yeah, and the broken biscuits aren't carbs
yeah,
because
no.
that process of breaking gets rid of it. Calories leak out. Yeah, all of that. But we've got this conflation of eating meat with climate change activism. And
Mm,
so there's the whole alignment of health of our body with health of the planet. And while, we can certainly do things better in farming industries, particularly overseas, with the grain-fed finished cattle, being a majority of the meat that people have. But also there's been some systematic reviews done in which the associations between colorectal cancer and meat eating are so poor and so low that you can't use that to make any public health recommendations. And of course, all this research is horribly affected by all your confounding factors, which we think of as a confounding factor. To explain that quite simply is, say, you've got a factor that affects an outcome, but it also independently affects another factor. So an easy example is getting becoming obese because of TV watching, right? And so it's not the act of watching the television that makes you obese, but it's actually the act of the junk food is the confounding factor,
right.
because you are more likely to eat the junk food while watching TV, which leads to the watching TV is associated with
Yeah,
obesity,
yeah, yeah.
because it's not like the TV is shooting fat cells into your body.
Yeah.
There's no
It might
biological.
be. It might be,
It
Sarah.
might be, but
Need a clinical
or you're
study.
watching ads that are going to make you eat more and more of this junk food that you might
Yeah.
have stashed in your pantry. So the junk food is the confounding factor there because it affects the outcome of becoming obese, but it's also having an impact on the TV watching. So anyway, so we've got red meat eating, but that's also confounded by things like lower incomes, because the people who are reporting eating more meat are doing things like they're smoking more, they're drinking more alcohol, they are less wealthy, and all of those things have an impact on longevity and cancer. And so, and you can't calculate out all those things. Yeah, so they're just associations, they're not causation. And if you think of causation as, you see a collapsed roof after a storm, and there's a cat sunbathing on it. Now, that sunbathing cat did not cause that roof to collapse, but because it's there, it would have to be an extraordinarily heavy cat dropped from a very great height. And that's just simply not going to happen. And that simply didn't cause the roof to collapse. But that's like saying that the cat sunbathing on this collapsed roof caused the roof to collapse.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's interesting in the meat thing.
Mm,
And so we've never had a point in human history where the actual eating of meat, which has meant that we've evolved to how we look today, whether it's the shortening of our jaws and the enlargement of our brains and the ability to, we evolved to capture and cook and eat
mm.
meat. Yeah. So that's an issue. So those associations are really low anyway. Yeah. I think we've gone off topic a wee bit. Yeah.
We have.
Yeah.
Welcome to my world, Dr. Sarah Hancock.
Yeah.
But I think it was really interesting. Like when I was running a wellness program at the mill here, I had a number of clients who said that they couldn't afford healthy eating. And I
Mm.
got them to actually do a breakdown of their budget for the week.
Yeah.
And one of them was spending $120 on takeaways. And
Yeah.
then the other one was spending $160 on booze, cigarettes, and takeaways. So
Mm.
I think that for people watching, it's looking, what you're saying is looking at quality calories and also that
Yeah.
investing. You're investing in
Yeah.
long-term health. Like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you
Yeah.
substitute some food around?
Yeah. Because I mean, your health is your wealth. I mean, people who are not healthy, they have one dream, and that's to be healthy.
Yeah.
Healthy people have thousands of dreams that they can get on and accomplish. But if you're unhealthy, like say you've got joint problems because of chronic inflammation, that has an effect on how you might spend your weekends. You can't go walking around, lovely old cities while you're traveling because it's just too painful.
Mm.
Um, but the whole healthy food thing, and I find it rather insulting that there's this belief that healthy food is expensive and that sort of thing. And that's a problem in the wellness influencer space because you see them eating foods that are sometimes difficult to access, that are not available. Things like courgettes, for instance. There's a limited season for those. There's a glut of them at the end of summer. But for the rest of the year, that's way too expensive for most people to afford regularly. But, good food can be less expensive. There is nothing wrong with those cheaper cuts of meat, but there's a whole range of barriers for people to eat as healthily as they might want to, which I did explore through my PhD as well too. And it comes down to time, and it comes down to, other health issues like stress. There's a whole raft of influences at multiple levels in the society in which we live in, whether it's your family unit, whether it's the community you live in. And, for instance, we know that lowest areas characterized by a certain level of socioeconomic deprivation, there are more eating outlets called Carl's Jr.'s. The first McDonald's was established in Cannons Creek and Pororua back in the early 90s in New Zealand. The food environment there looks completely different to how that might look in somewhere like Remuera or Takapuna or other, wealthier parts of New Zealand.
Mm.
Yeah. And so the
It's
perception
crazy
of it.
though, isn't it? Because when you look at, I know in terms of the keto, we've studied similar things, but
Mm,
if you look at like if you go to McDonald's and you have a hamburger and fries, because there's no fiber in it,
mm,
you or your children are going to feel hungry an hour later, probably.
yeah,
You've spent
yeah,
however, I won't go to, but to McDonald's, I won't go there, on principle. But the cost of that versus buying
yeah,
half a kilo of mince and a packet of frozen vegetables,
yeah. And there's
right? And
nothing wrong with frozen vegetables.
that meal will keep you full all day if you
Absolutely.
probably
Yeah.
3 days if you just ate that.
If you just ate those things, and they've done
Yeah.
done studies where what contributes to expensive family budgets for food intake are the between meal snacks
Mm,
and soft drinks.
wow.
And they did this in Brazil, and there's been a lot of studies come out of Brazil and South America because they've taken on board the ultra food processing messages a bit well, and so doing a whole lot of research in that area. And there's been some research done at AUT on this, where they looked at the cost of, say, low carb, healthy fat eating, and found that actually the price difference between that and a diet, characterized by a whole lot of snack foods and a high carb diet was about the cost of a cup of coffee per day.
Yeah.
And just I'm very, very sensitive to the fact that actually, we have problems with the affordability of food and the cost of living, but there's a lot of money gets spent on between meal snacks
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the coffees at work, or the coffees on the way to work, or the what you buy at the service station
Ice
when
cream,
you go to
sports,
fuel
European
your
products.
car. You don't
Yeah.
have to get additional fuel for yourself, but there's all that stuff there, and someone announces that, well, today you've saved $2.50 on your petrol because you've got a Smiles card or your Z card or whatever. And there's all this stuff that, there's might be some piece of chocolate on the counter, and the stuff is all within arm's reach. And so you think, oh, well, I've saved $2, and something goes
Yeah.
that you didn't want and certainly probably didn't need, but it's there. And so there's all those sorts of things that add to your expenditure on food.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. But we
We
do
we're
know
going
that
to,
actually the
I
snacking.
think we are going to have to do another part
Yeah.
and probably part 3 with Dr. Sarah Hancock, because I'm going to have to get off and go and get my children from school.
Okay, yes, it's that time of the day, isn't it, over
Yeah.
there? Yeah,
Yeah. But I'll pop your details into the comments for anybody that wants to learn more. And then let's organize, because you've got some amazing slides from your PhD, Sarah, and some publications that you've done. So I would love for people to be able to find out more about you,
yeah,
and also the research that you've done on oral health and general health as well.
yeah. That sounds great.
Will that be all
Yeah,
right?
that'll be good.
We'll
Yeah.
do part 2. Dun dun dun.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea because I mean there's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. And
PhD worth, Dr. Sarah Hancock. Hey.
yeah, and I think there's just it's just so multifaceted, where all this goes insofar
Mm,
as population health, what you can do, how eating healthily is difficult, that there's a lot of barriers that exist for people today that weren't probably in existence,
mm,
when possibly we were children, and certainly not when our parents were children as well too. I mean, we'll just finish by sort of, 2 kids have just had their teeth removed over the time of this podcast. And that, there's some very real distress out there caused by poor health over the life course, and it's reducing quality of life all over the show. So, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So one suggestion, right? If we could leave the listeners with one suggestion of something they could alter in their diet, what do you think would be the key for oral health,
Probably,
oral health?
probably to eat a diet that minimizes the intake of between meal snacks on highly processed foods, as we've defined them as that hyperpalatable, more than 5 ingredients, the stuff that's in the central aisles of your supermarket. If you're going to have a snack between meals, have something like cheese or even salami or fruit, more than just having muffins or things that might have that you don't recognize as having grown above the ground or swum, flown, walked
Mm,
the earth. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably the number one thing you can do to improve your oral health is to not have those and to cut out the sugary drinks.
mm, mm,
Yeah, that would be the number one recommendation.
mm,
Yeah. And to, keep some control over what you've got in your pantry when you've got small children. You can't change what they might be offered at sports events, whatever. But if, what you do the majority of the time is important and
mm.
is ultimately is what is going to matter. Yeah. You
So
do
I had
have
a client last year, Sarah, and we did a challenge. And
mm-hmm.
all she did it was a 3-month challenge. All she did was cut out, she was drinking Coke every day,
Oh
and
yeah.
she lost 10 kilos.
Wow.
That was all she did. She
Yeah.
just cut out Coke.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yes,
Yeah.
she didn't change anything else, but just cut out the fizzy, and it was so dramatic.
Those small changes can,
Mm.
have some really cool effects.
Yeah.
Even if while you're having a cup of tea or coffee, you don't have to have it with anything.
Mm,
You can just have the cup of tea and have the cup of coffee. And Nigel Latter is the big one for just sit down and enjoy the cup of tea, and try and build that time into your day where you're not doing mindless eating and,
yeah.
snacking or even drinking the coffee while walking to work, or just actually enjoy the food that you eat. Yeah. And, give yourself some sort of rules around it and realize that actually the food that you eat does have an impact on your health.
Mm.
And that can have effects all through the life course. Yeah.
That is lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you
You're
so much,
welcome.
Sarah, for your time
It's
and
been
for
fun. It's been fun
your
chatting.
research. All right, well, let's organize part 2. I will be in touch.
Okay. Sounds
Okay.
great. Yeah.
Lots of love.
Lots of love to you too. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.